We hear much about the beast system, a sort of more arcane way of saying don't hate the player, hate the game. And I personally agree with this. The lack of food, water and finance can drive even the most rational person to the most desperate actions. We've traced this death cult back to ancient times, a time when we are said to have lived under the original sun. Beyond the purple dawn and into a golden age of Eden, the sun that ruled the sky back then is believed to have been Saturn or Cronus, Old Father Time and Death. But how does this affect the world today? Who created the modern day beast system that greases the wheels of what is essentially an Indian caste system from the shadows? An apt name I feel for this system today is the Saturn Debt Cult. The Saturn Debt Cult was of course created by the Saturn Death Cult, outlined in Troy McLachlan's book of the same name. When religion began to wane and the people started to see that the priest class had no special connection or authority with their chosen gods, the cult needed a new way of controlling the masses. Thus came the private banking system. This new control system cast your political vote null and void. Instead of the individual countries printing their currency, the Saturn Death Cult were given the freedom to print currency at 10 times the amount of that which had been deposited in their private banks. And even worse, they were allowed to charge usury, which they criminally called interest, on money conjured up by these black magicians out of thin air. And from then on, the private banking families, such as the Sabbatean Frankist Rothschilds, were able to sink countries into unpayable debts. They did this by orchestrating conflicts and wars and funding all sides. This still happens today. Then charging interest on the loans for these manufactured conflicts and then picking up the contracts for the clean-up process of the mess they orchestrated in the first place. Problem, reaction, solution. Today, through compromat and dodgy deals, this Saturn Debt Cult now also issue debt, not only in money, but in the knowledge of what you know about who you know, which equals out as who you own. The higher you climb up in this Indian caste system today, the more debt you acquire in the dirty deeds you had to commit in order to get your leg up. This is the Saturn Debt Cult today. Money is the debt for the masses. Compromat is the debt for those desperate and shallow enough to spin the wheel. Pick your poison, indeed. Hi guys, welcome to this week's Classified here on Ickonic.com. It's part 2 of the Saturn Death Cult here today with Troy McLachlan, who wrote the book, and you'll see of part 1 where you can see the cosmology part of it and where this actually comes from, and that's fascinating in itself. But how does that play out in the world today? So today we're going to talk at the banking system, or talk about the banking system even, and how it's playing into what we're going to see hopefully not happen soon, but it looks that way. Central bank digital currencies and the Solomon's Temple and all of this stuff that leads back round to a system where you will be a device within the Internet of Bodies. That sounds wonderful, all cheery. How are you, Troy?
I'm very good, and thank you very much for having me back. Had a great time last week. Looking forward to today.
Well, thank you for coming back. We really appreciate it. So let's pick this up at the late 1700s, I believe. Then we're talking about the Rothschilds. We're talking about the Mayer Amschel Rothschild, the Bavarian Illuminati, even a bit of Sabbatai Zevi in there, Jacob Frank, that kind of era where it seems to be 3 strands of these things: symbology, the Saturn symbology, the money system, and even the bloodline rules and the secret society seem to have come together around about that point. Am I on the right ballpark there?
Absolutely. I would describe it as a hidden kingdom of merchant bankers has taken over the world since the late 1700s. Basically, the Napoleonic era, the demise of the Catholic Church and its role in society, and the emergence of basically a central banking system based upon the Bank of England experiment that had been going on for a good 100 years prior to that. I'll note that in my book, people will read my reference to an outfit called the Red Shield, which is an obvious reference to the Rothschild family. But I am always at pains to point out to people that the Rothschilds were very much a Johnny-come-lately to the scenario. My own, so there's been a lot of grief on their Jewish background, as it's attracted a lot of attention by certain elements in society. My own ethnic group of people, the Scots, were probably more involved in setting up central banking than any Jewish concerns in its origins. And we can see people like John Laws and the people who were involved in John Laws, who effectively his financial advice to the French kingdom under Louis the 16th, I think it was, the Sun King anyway, led to the horrendous French Revolution consequences that they suffered. And various other Scots people who were involved in setting up the Bank of England. And this concept, and it can only be described as the most perfect system of enslavement of a nation of people that you could ever imagine. It is quite mind-boggling to me even today, the idea that they could gain a monopoly on lending a form of currency at a finite amount, but demand an extra amount back that doesn't exist, called interest. And if you can't pay it, you basically start to lose your country, your freedoms, your ability to rule yourselves. And the system has been, it bloomed in the late 1700s, as you pointed out, the end of the Napoleonic Wars, the defeat of Napoleon, and ultimately also re-established itself in the most important country of that era, the emerging United States, by 1913. It was at its zenith during the 1930s, going into the 1950s with the Bretton Woods agreements and the establishment of the United States dollar as, well, the Federal Reserve dollar as the world currency. And now it's in big trouble in terms of its future and its ability to continue the cycle. We can discuss that later as we go on, because I consider that to be the most optimistic aspect of discussing this, central banking system. But yes, it's been quite simply the most destructive hidden element in Western civilization that we have ever known, and its power has reached almost absolute status in the time up till today. Terrifying.
So we're at this stage now where it looks like it's going to fall down. Is this cyclical? I've read somewhere, and I can't remember for the life of me where I read this, that it was about 110 years you give these things, these cycles of these financial cycles that tend to kind of die out after that time. Is that something that you've heard?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. There are two main cycles really at play. There is the, every 420 years or so, called the turning, that takes place. We're certainly entering into a 420-year cycle of turning in terms of Western civilization. But in terms of a banking system that is based on issuing money as a debt, the system rarely exceeds 70 years in operation. It provides boom in the first 30 to 40 years. By 70 years, it's in real trouble. It can, if it is reset in certain ways, it can last a good 120 years. And we have seen exactly that take place with the current system that is operating out of after the emergence of the Federal Reserve Bank in the United States and its hegemony over world finance. But yes, any system that operates on the false measure of interest, where you are lending people a finite amount of something and demanding extra back on that as repayment, and that extra does not exist, but somehow entitles you to now own the productivity of the people who couldn't pay that extra bit, that system will always implode on itself within 70 to 80 years. And we are seeing that implosion take place. The trick for the banking system, and I'm going to plug a book, a writer, Joseph P. Farrell, who's written a couple of books, Babylon's Banksters, followed by The Vipers of Venice. I actually have it, if anybody sort of sees that, I can't recommend his books writing on understanding how the system has been bubbling under the surface until its full emergence in 1913. It bubbled under the surface since the days of Babylon, and it has successfully created crisis after crisis in which it then reinvents itself and presents itself as the solution to the crisis it actually created, the financial crisis it actually created. There have been some incredibly highly destructive times where this happened. I would suggest the single most destructive reset took place in the 1540s. Or I'm sure, it's 1540s. It's the Black Death, when 70% of the European population lost its life, and everything sort of tracks back to a financial dispute out of a system that is without doubt traceable to this Babylonian system that we now see today, manifested as the Federal Reserve in the English central banking model.
So, what is the connection back to Babylon when we see that the Tower of Babel is clearly replicated in the Bank of International Settlements? The building, anyway, clearly, in my opinion, is a copy of that, or at least nodding to that. So what is that connection back to Babylon then in terms of the financial system?
Well, okay, I think the operative word they use there is system at the end. And for many people, when they come into studying history, they're seeing it through a uniquely 20th century, 19th century lens, where people tend to view the world in terms of nations, the nation state. But prior to that, even in Renaissance times, people understood the world operating in terms of systems. And this is why when you look at the way central banks operate today, a lot of people find it incredible that they don't seem to subscribe to patriotic ideals that most of us have who are part of a nation state. You find in the Second World War that the Bank of England, Bank of Germany, and so on like that are still doing business at the height of both the Second and the First World Wars. And people find that almost incomprehensible, that a Bank of England would be doing business with German or Austrian banks at that time. And the reason for that is that the people who are involved in international banking, they don't see the world in terms of nation states. They see the world in terms of systems. And in the ancient context, a system was always symbolized by reference to a city. So whether it's biblical texts, whether it is other ancient texts out of the Roman, Greek world, Babylonian texts, and so on, when people refer to a city, they're not referring to a nation, a city-state, as in we think of a nation-state. I'm Babylonian, this is the team I support, that kind of thing. What they are referring to is they're referring to a way of doing things.
So that would be kind of, just to pick up on that point, that would be then why they call the banking system in the UK or London the city. They call it the city, don't they?
I think there's a very strong, people would even call it a spiritual connection there, kind of like a psychic fingerprint, as to where these guys actually come from. Because in my opinion, the city of London is the seat of all evil in the world that we operate. The Federal Reserve is merely a tool of those institutions that are established in the City of London. I think people will be shocked to find nobody's really seen who the true private owners of the American Federal Reserve System are. But when they do find out who is incorporated, and they'll find that all these people register their headquarters in the City of London. And so an ancient person living today would understand the world in terms of systems, and they would see not the world in terms of those colored pieces that we carve out of maps and so on, say this is England, this is Germany, this is Russia, and so on, like that. They would be looking purely at the world as to which systems dominate, and they would identify the Holy See, the Vatican, as one particular system. They would identify a series of representative locations, starting with Babylon through Jerusalem into Venice, into Amsterdam, and into London. And that city of London would be the next system. And they would identify a military system that is now most prominently run out of Washington, D.C., also set up as a kind of corporate entity as opposed to part of a nation state. The element that most ancient people would recognize is that these power bases, these centers of power in the modern world, have retained their system identification through the concept of being a city-state, where it's not important to them who their citizens are. What's important is the system they run and its dominance over the rest of the peoples on the planet. And so the Vatican, City of London, Washington, D.C. This would be what most ancient people would look at and say, yes, that's what Babylon was, or that's what Jerusalem in Christian Muslim times was, or Rome was, or something like that. And so I go to great lengths to point out that in my book that the Tower of Babel story is not a story about a real estate project. It's not a story about even technology and such. It's a story about a system that used one form of economic language, but that language was in opposition to the divinely inspired language of economics, which we discussed as being the golden age, set of weights and measures, laws, systems, and so on that people tried to preserve. But this new city system that you've got in Babylon is one in which there is a man-made concept, or Babel, the Tower of Babel. It's a man-made concept of economics that threatens to supplant the authority of God in terms of how people relate to each other. And the confusion of languages is mostly about how that economic system, based on diverse weights and measures, i.e. unequal weights and measures, eventually implodes. It's the story of the first human-made catastrophe after a series of global interplanetary catastrophes that shaped the modern world.
So this would be a system, I believe, that was based on the scarcity that came about after we see the shifts in the planets, the changing of Saturn and the sun, and obviously the daylight being changed, the seasons happening, and the scarcity of things that they had in abundance suddenly no longer being there. And then you've got the whole, go back to part one to sort of understand what happened there. But is a system based on scarcity and fear, would that be right to say?
Yeah, well, it's the fear of scarcity, all right, that galvanizes populations to try and work together to create economic systems to deal with that, to develop surpluses and so on. But you cannot run an economic system to any great degree unless you have a set of agreed to weights and measures. Money, the concept of money or currency in its form, being the most important weight and measure for the governing of people dealing with each other, being able to set prices, being able to agree to prices, being able to exchange goods and services in order to find a way to combat the effects of scarcity, to avoid famine, to avoid scarcity. The problem with money is that, as the biblical saying goes, the love of it is the root of all evil. And people in ancient times, particularly within the priesthoods, saw the perfect opportunity to use money as an unequal measure of work done. They use it as a measure of how people set their prices, but to put it out as an unequal measure that gives them an advantage in terms of control over the greater population who are productive. And thereby, by having control of the monetary system, particularly if it is issued as a form of currency that is a debt to the people, i.e. we'll give you 100 of these gold bars, but you better give us 11 gold, 101 gold bars at the end of the year, or we get to take everything you've made, and so on. How can I say, the motivation, the temptation to use such a system to set yourself up in such a way that you don't have to graft hard to be productive, but you can make claim on everybody else's productivity without them tumbling to the idea that it's a form of theft. That is what takes over civilization on its march, down through the ages. The Tower of Babel story, whether it is a reference to Babylon itself or an actual precursor to Babylon, it is allegorical at best and should be treated allegorical in terms of understanding this. But in terms of where we get the first references to this system being set up, we go back to Babylon again, which is the gold statue that Nebuchadnezzar supposedly set up that everybody had to bow down. And I will make an important distinction here for people who, discount the Bible as a historical source. I am talking purely on a historical, not a spiritual basis. But what I'm pointing out here is that gold statue, all right, when it was erected, you're given its measurements, and its measurements come out to 666 cubits. All right. Where have we heard that number as well? We've heard that number in the book of Revelation, which talks about a beast, which institutes a mark that is, and his number is 666, and everybody thinks this is some grotesque individual. What we're actually talking about is a man-made system that ensures you can't buy or sell unless you take part in a system that is based on the number 666. And I would argue that that goes back to that gold statue, which was the beginning of a gold standard, and then the issuance of money backed by gold by the Babylonians that was so at odds with the how can I put it, the just forms of monetary systems that had been established during the Golden Age and after the Doomsday event by the Silver Age priesthoods.
And we still see this today. Bill Gates has just, his Microsoft has put out a body data harvesting system. The patent number is 060606. So we see this still here today. So how is that playing out in today's model era? We seem to be on the verge of it all collapsing in. I don't even know what that means, to be honest. Where are we today? Moving over to a cashless society. What is the state of play today? Because it seems like the BRICS places have always been moving around, so to speak.
Right. Well, what I point out, capitalizing what you said with Bill Gates and 060606. You got to remember the number 6 is predominantly identified in astrological terms with the planet Saturn, and that takes us all the way back to Saturn. It's also the number that is associated with man-made on the 6th day, various other things. The male of the species having 6 appendages to his torso, the head, the 2 arms, the 2 legs, and his genitals, which is where you get your 6-pointed star, the number 6. So effectively, that number 6 is so indicative of a man-made system masquerading as divine, or as having divine authority. See, this is the point I want people to realize. Saturn and the worship of the creator God and its systems is not a bad thing. It's when it is utilized by certain elite human individuals to kind of, I don't know, dress themselves up in a form of authority related to the creator God archetype, i.e. they speak for them. And so the Silver Age priesthoods, in whatever wisdom they had, clearly identified the number 6 as something to show that humans were messing with the whole Saturn legacy. And that's why you get this idea of man-made systems of governance that are based on humankind's ideas of laws, weights, measures, and so on, which are so subject to corruption of individuals. It's not true, and the number 6 is very much involved in that. So, what was it you were asking about? Where we stand today as far as these systems go. I think that we ended up last week saying I'm very optimistic. Blockchain, I think, is a electronic version of the concept of you shall not have diverse weights and measures. You can't cheat on it. All right. You can rip people off person to person, but the actual blockchain method of producing money, not currency, but money, people that something that people will take in exchange for their labors and so on, is a very good example of a system that cannot be mucked about by politicians, bankers, and such. The central banking digital currencies that we are hearing about, this is not blockchain. This is simply an electronic version. We've kind of had it for at least the last 30 years. I mean, I hardly ever use cash now in terms of how I'm sort of co-opted into their system and so on. They have that power over us in terms of control over the actual currency through electronic means, that central banking digital currencies will completely and utterly entrench in the system. But their problem is that they're in competition with the cryptocurrencies, the good ones being very good examples of a true weight and measure when it comes to money as a weight and measure, as opposed to what the central banks want.
So you said there, Joy, you said there's a difference between money and currency. Can we
Mm-hmm.
can we clear that up in the best way
Mm-hmm.
possible for people to understand?
Yeah, sure. To put it simply, so most people, when I was at school, we were all told, what's money? Money is a means of exchange. No, it's not. That's what currency is. Okay, currency is an accepted fungible measure or representation of money. Money is anything that somebody will accept in payment for whatever they produce or make. So in the original concept, if you make a loaf of bread and somebody says, I'll pay you with a couple of flagons of wine,
Yep.
for that, the wine is money in that exchange. Okay, if you're willing to accept the wine. But the problem with barter trade and such like that, of course, it has its massive limitations. It's not fungible and so on. So they need to create a fungible representation of money. And for many people, that becomes items, sort of elements from nature, such as gold, silver, and so on, that they are willing to accept. This is the key, that they are willing to accept as payment for their goods and services. Okay. What currency is when people say, I don't want to carry around gold, because gold and silver became the means by which most people accepted money. Somebody was selling loaves of bread, but you don't have something for them to exchange or swap for, but they're happy to receive gold from you, silver, then it's your objective to get that a supply of gold and silver so that you can make those transactions that you can't fulfill with what you're producing.
So the kind of clear that up, then it would be, say that you had something that I wanted, but
Mm-hmm.
I didn't have something that you wanted. I'd give you this in exchange, and then you could exchange that bit of gold later on for something that you do want. That was
That's
trying to get
right.
around that, so you weren't limited to the exchange between two products. You could open up the market, quite frankly, of what you could exchange it for. That's what it did.
Yeah. So, as I say, money by definition is anything I'm willing to accept from you in payment for something you want to buy from me.
Yep.
Okay. Currency is a different thing altogether. Currency is something that people will accept as a representation of money. And originally it was backed by gold. In other words, you could take a currency, a token, a piece of paper or a clay tablet back in the old days, and you could exchange it for what you considered to be, that currency's worth. So if it was equal to 1 ounce of gold, you could exchange it for 1 ounce of gold. And so people had to create deposits of gold in order to issue currency. This is where the corruption becomes manifest, the temptation for corruption, because if you can then dictate how those tokens, that currency, is issued in relation to the money, the gold, the silver, cracky, it can be the grain. You could have the temples store grain and say, we've got this amount, we're issuing, $1 million worth of currency, 1 million clay tokens, that's the currency, trade with this, and so on like that. But if you bring back your token, you can have, 1 a millionth of the grain in exchange. Well, you can do that with gold's better because gold you can't destroy gold. It doesn't rust. It doesn't become, sort of what they call it, perishable.
So they can
over
set the value of the product. By doing that, they were able to say this is how much this is worth, and kind
That's
of
right.
set that. Whereas two people before could go, what's it worth to you? This is what it's worth to me. Can we come to some sort of arrangement? So they were going in the middle, saying, no, this is what it's worth on the market, and we want to set, and we can chop and change that at will depending on what our wants and needs are.
Yeah. Well, see, the whole issuance of currency allows two people to conduct business that don't have mutually desirable goods for exchange. All right. If one guy wants a loaf of bread and the other guy is only willing to exchange it for a bottle of wine, but somebody doesn't have a bottle of wine, then currency is used to give him the same purchasing power for that loaf of bread as a bottle of wine would be. And that's measured in the currency that is issued. But that currency must be backed by something for people to have faith in it, that they can exchange that currency, that piece of paper, that even that metal coin. In the old days, it was, when I say the old days, ancient days, it was clay tablets, receipts, basically. And you just simply took the receipt back to get your portion of the gold that was stored at a temple. Then the temple started realizing they could issue gold coins as a form of currency. And people, had the gold in their hands, so to speak, and such, or they could go to the temple and they could purchase gold coins in exchange for whatever the temple was willing to accept. And this is the early days of how the money system worked. Where it all starts to go wrong is something that we are still cursed with today. It's a thing called fractional reserve banking, which is the idea that I've got 1 ounce of gold, and everybody thinks that 1 ounce of gold equals one receipt that I issue if I'm a temple priest. But then I suddenly realized that not everybody is going to come back and demand their ounce of gold at the end of the day, at the end of the week, at the end of the month, the year, or even the decade. They're going to just trade with that receipt. So why don't I offer a couple more? Why don't I offer 10 of them? Why don't I offer 35 of them? Why don't I offer 100 of these receipts? And it creates a boom in the economy. But when you get a run, when everybody goes, your receipt isn't backed by gold, it's your 100 pieces only gets you 100th part of the gold. Then there's a run on the bank, you have a collapse. This is how the gold system fails. It fails not because it's not a good way of backing money. It fails when people decide to issue bits of currency against that gold, where every bit of currency has the same claim on the single piece of gold. All right. And there's 100 of them out there. And obviously it's the first come, first serve in a situation like that. And, this is the system that kicks off the Babylonian system, the gold statue on the plains of Dura that everybody had to bow down to, which ultimately is, prophesied of as a ongoing system in the Western world in the book of Revelation. This beast system that has many manifestations, backed by gold, silver, precious metals, ultimately by fractional reserve banking, and then ultimately by corrupted currencies. This is what I'm getting at. Currencies are where you corrupt money. All right. So whoever controls the issuance of a currency has the potential to corrupt the system to their benefit, but it will always have its chooks that come home to roost. All right. It's always going to be, it's always going to implode on itself. At some point, somebody's going to go, hang on a minute. If you and me take this piece of each of our currency back, only one of us will get the gold for it.
Yep.
In terms of the overall society, and this is what collapses the system long term. It's also the means by which you then institute a system which really came into its own as something that was acceptable in society only in the last 200 years. And that is the idea of instituting interest or usury on the 100 pieces of currency that you put out. All right. At the end of the year, there better be 11 given back to the bank. 101.
Yep.
All right. Currency, 110 currencies. And everybody goes, well, where do you get the extra 1 or 10 pieces of currency? You don't. But the bank's saying, now I own your stuff because you didn't do this. This is where we're at today, making it possibly the most frightening time in terms of man-made catastrophe that the human species has ever been through.
Yeah, and I liken it to one of those machines where you pop the pound in and it pushes it all to the front. There's nothing there. There's more going in than coming out. Something that really fascinates me right now then is when we look at Elon Musk and look back at his grandfather, who was a head of Technocracy Inc., or a founding member of Technocracy Inc. One of the
Yeah.
things that they had, or their main push, was a thing called the energy economy, and it appears to me that relates to the 0606 patent, which basically would make that you a rat on the wheel. So what they're paying for you, from what I can understand, there's a Black Mirror episode about this, by the way, of your energy. They give you a compliance, a task to do. You would do that task, and they would pay you in crypto, which would take up your time. So it would be based on the amount of energy and time you put into a task. Now that seems to be what just with that information. That seems insane to me, but that seems to be that they're trying to push it towards this with the technology, and they can track this system. That seems like a modern update of the beast system, but using you, who are the only free energy that's ever created, and you'll always be free energy, and taking you as the product all the time.
Yeah, I mean, it's a play on the concept of being able to capitalize on your own labor and it being expected to pay. But again, it's about control of the means by which you are paid. So we go back to the most succinct way that I feel has ever been put, which is in the book of Revelation. You can't buy or sell lest you take the mark of this beast. Okay. So any financial system where money purely remains anything that you are willing to accept for your labor and the products that you produce, all right, then I have no problem with how that works. Where you have a problem with the way the modern system is number one, is the system by which they pay you a form of debt? In other words, you're in debt upon receiving that system and therefore have to work harder and harder. The second thing that I would always argue against is the modern concept of private ownership of that which we don't create. All right. How can I put this? The idea, you probably heard stories about the wise American Indian chiefs upon being told that Western settlers were trying to buy the land, and they had no concept of the sale of land because they didn't consider land could be owned by any particular individual, land being the product of whatever creator God concept they had at that time. And our modern day system, particularly in the West, has been corrupted to the idea that somewhere along the line, that which human beings cannot create became how can be eligible for ownership by individuals. And those individuals secured their ownership through dubious financial systems based on this debt financing sort of model. So the idea is that if you look at the resources of the world, name me one resource in the world that human beings actually created. There isn't one. They didn't create air. They didn't create the water that we see in the world. They didn't create the oil. They didn't even create the land that we walk upon or the oceans that we sail upon or anything like that. Okay?
I suppose you could argue that ideas is probably the only
Yes.
thing.
Well, it's the only thing. It's I think Schiller or Goethe, the one of those German philosopher types, said that the closest thing that a human being can come to being godlike is in the creation of music and stories. All right, that's where we are most godlike in terms of it. And yes, you have absolutely every right to claim ownership over if you write a book, a novel, if you write a symphony, a hit tune, or whatever it is. Okay, intellectual rights you have absolute ownership of, but we don't survive in this world based on anything that we have created. We have to survive on the air we breathe, the water we drink, the food we consume, and the land that we live on and shelter ourselves on as far as that goes. And we talked about this in our last episode about the creator God archetype being the ultimate bulwark for ensuring that human beings can never legally enslave other human beings, let alone come to own land that is not theirs. The problem with land ownership is that it all comes with the advent of the priest kings, who began to speak as if they spoke with the authority of God, quickly jettisoned the idea that they had any come back from God in what they decreed, but loved the idea that whatever they decreed was now law. And so therefore, if God owns all the earth, if God owns everything by right of creation, and I speak for God, guess what? I own it. And this is why property ownership starts pretty much with William I of England, when he starts divvying up the land as reward to his nobles after the Battle of Hastings, the conquest of England in 1066, and starts this whole concept of nobility being the rightful owners, not custodians, but owners, which they can then buy, sell, and so on. And there's been a dilution down through that time where parcels of land that they claim ownership of has been sold off. And now we are stuck with this idea that wealth gets you ownership over that which you cannot create. So that's why the love of money becomes entrenched. If you have a system that allows you to monopolize the issuance of money, I care not who is in office, let me issue a nation's currency, and I care not who runs that country. That kind of power that the central banking types and then their minions underneath them who come into work in various, what you would call capitalists of the system, monopolists in actual nature. The whole idea is to monopolize the whole of what you would call the natural world if you're an atheist, or the created world if you're religious, to monopolize that under private ownership, and to give that to certain individuals according to where they sit in the current financial system.
We're looking at now then. So say this thing collapses. You're talking about blockchain and the benefits of that now. So, but that would rely, in my understanding, on the technology that's need to be used to access that blockchain being able to get to you. So that's where, or you're being able to use it. So therefore, that comes back to the mark of the beast, being able to buy and sell. You have to be allowed in. So then this is where possibly, call me a conspiracy theorist, this chip comes in.
Yeah.
Is that what we're seeing here? Is them setting up these systems? Look at Spotify. If you look into the Spotify, it's just an example. They're one of their founders. Sorry, one of their financial. They own the shares in it, exactly the same as what they own shares in Tesla as well. And you find out they're a Chinese media company that seem to be buying shares up in all these technology companies, and you find that they're getting closer and closer to buying all of these up. Are we looking at another system buying the ability, the technology that will allow you to get into this system anyway? The system itself might be all right on the inside, but if you can't get in, you can't get in.
In other words, whoever controls the on-off switch for the internet controls any form of cryptocurrency or central bank digital currency and so on. What I would say about that is that while they still have control over the nation state apparatus that has been created in the last 200 years, i.e., they have a monopoly over conducting violence against whoever they wish, to do so. Yes, you are still going to have the problem where, people. I'll give you an example. People say about crypto stuff, if you don't lose your password, if you don't lose your seed or whatever like that, nobody can steal from you. And so on. Okay, so that's very simple for the actual criminal minded. You just basically start taking a hammer to their toes and say, "Give me the password," and such. And government has shown itself over the centuries, whether it's as a kingdom or as a secular state or whatever, it has shown itself completely non-adverse to the idea of torturing its citizens and the people under its control to maintain control over whatever currency system, not money system, but currency system is there, because this idea of legal tender is what backs up currency. You can only use our currency to buy and sell because we got to tax you to pay for the interest that we owe to the central banks. I mean, that's the circular reasoning of the argument, what it is in a nutshell. However, my thinking is this, is that at this time, the system that was perfected under the Rothschilds, the central banking system, and ultimately instituted on a global scale at Bretton Woods through the Federal Reserve, the US dollar, and so on, and such, is itself, it can never turn off that that internet of things, connections, that web of interconnectedness without destroying itself. So it's caught in a situation where it has to root out people who go their own way in terms of trading with one another on a case-by-case level, quite literally, which means they've got to employ a lot of people. We've seen this in America. They're employing, well, I can't remember the figure, was it 70,000 more Inland Revenue Service people to go after people for the taxes and so on like that, okay? So yes, they could turn off the whole system, and that would absolutely bung up everything for anybody else operating using that technology and such, but they kill themselves in the process. Or they've got to employ people to go after people who are operating outside the system. In the old days, if you instituted a financial system, let's say, and it happened in America even recently, they tried putting up silverback systems at a local level. What happens? You get a visit from a SWAT team. You get put into jail. They shut that down. They're not doing that because your system doesn't work and it's fraudulent. They're doing it because it's a threat to their own monopoly on the money system as it stands. But how do you do that? How do you track people down en masse who are trading over the internet using systems that the central bank cannot control, that the central bank cannot issue 100 billion more worth of Bitcoin just to spike the stock market that's being paid in Bitcoin or anything along those lines, like they've been doing with the current system? How do they control that? They're trying to convince us that there's criminals that are the only ones that would use Bitcoin today. My question today is, well, what did criminals use before Bitcoin? They used your money, didn't they? So it was, it's a self-defeating argument, if you know what I mean. So they're totally dependent on the idea that they can pay people who are willing to accept their form of currency to go after people who are operating outside that form of currency. And the problem that we have in today's world is that irrespective of the technology and such, all right, you have a system that doesn't allow manipulation in terms of interest and falsifying the amount of a currency that's out there to not match what people believe is out there. You have now nuclear armed nations who are deciding to split from the current central banking Western financial debt-based system. And they don't have the capacity, short of nuking the entire world, organizing a nuclear holocaust, of stopping this and ultimately losing that control that they've had for the last 200 years.
So it sounds like a fancy poetic way of putting it. So has the Saturn death cult morphed into the Saturn debt cult over time?
I think it always was, in that sense. We discussed before that the ideology about this, I mean, when you're talking about my idea of a Saturn death cult, you're talking about people who are willing to engage in a system that exploits a majority of people for the benefit of a minority. And we discussed, why would somebody want to do that, really? Even a normal person, why would they want to become part of it? And this is where all these archetypes from Saturn worship come into play at a quasi-religious occult level. And we discussed the idea that the average Joe Bloggs who gets involved in banking and that may actually, if he's talented enough, be presented with the idea that he can somehow influence a creator God force out there, that when he's born again into another life, he can be born into, he doesn't have to be one of the minions, he can be part of the bloodline, so to speak. And of course, this is the basis of so much of the Illuminati concepts and such that have come down through the ages, that the idea of being born into those bloodlines is enough for some people to want to do the things that they think will endear them to a creator God, which include human sacrifice. And they only have to look at the mythology of Saturn eating his own children to get the idea, hey, that's divine practice. If I engage in it, I'm one of the gang. I'm part of the Saturn thing. And some people They don't even have the Saturn connection. It's just Satanism. It's maybe a form of paganistic worship where they're willing to engage in it. And unfortunately, in places like Africa, it's really resurging. They're killing kids so that businessmen can feel that they're going to have a successful launch of their business or things like that. This is growing again, but it's not unique to Africa. It's been practiced in all civilizations. Mesoamerica was probably the worst example in known human history, other than possibly Carthage and the Canaanite forms of this practice. But yes, they ultimately want to be part of a system that has control over the world. They want to live forever. They want to be reborn into these forever living signs, living bloodlines. And it turns out that the way to ensure that the vast majority of us never cotton on, because they wouldn't last a day if the vast majority of us truly understood the concepts that drive human sacrifice, that drive so much of their efforts to put us into debt. But that debt system is the best way to facilitate what they want at the expense of everybody else's productivity, without everybody else cottoning onto it too quickly.
It seems like then maybe this kind of want in the conspiracy terms, the conspiracy circles, to pin it on a group of people, to pin it on a specific even race of people, which again, some of these aren't races, they're religions, but is a desperate attempt to try and get out of something that we're all stuck in, a death cult or a debt cult that's been around so long that we don't know how to get out of. Some of the names here: Freeman, Reynolds, Onassis, Russell, Bundy, Rockefeller, Lee, Van Doon, Rothschild, DuPont, Astor, Collins. Some ancient bloodlines. Some will call that the black nobility. Some of the black nobility bloodlines there. It seems like that even maybe they don't know how to get out of this anymore. It's like it's such a tangled web. What do we do from here? Because you can't reset it completely. Because as you say, it'll be a nuke on the world regardless of anything. It'll be carnage. It would be chaos. So, do you feel like there's a point where actually no one knows what the answer is here anymore?
I don't actually think that. I think and I'm not giving us all a plug who work in this sort of area and so on. But it's these kinds of discussions that you couldn't have had 20 years ago, between people who've never met or anything like that. They're making people question how our society works. And for me, the big thing is we've got to get back to weights and measures that we can trust. And we can trust in the justice of it. We can't have a system where there are laws that are broken by certain elites and everybody says, well, we'll make new laws to make sure they don't break the old laws and so on. No, just prosecute them according to the laws we've established. We're so far past that now that whole system has to be, has to get back to the idea that there are certain weights and measures and laws that must be applied equally for anybody to have any confidence in engaging in civilizational behavior or social behavior. But I would point to the writings of the late Anthony C. Sutton, professor of economics at Stanford University, who wrote a series of books in the 1970s, National Suicide. I can't remember if that was, sorry, you'll have to correct me. I think it's National Suicide and so on, where he showed how international banking and the international corporate cartels were actually engaging in practices that were at odds with the national priorities of the nations they supposedly came out of. Ford Motor Company was helping Soviet Russia build tanks and stuff like that. Okay, but he later on went on to write a very influential book that detailed the Skull and Bones secret society of Skull and Bones Yale, or is it Harvard? I think it's Yale.
Yeah.
It's Yale, yeah. So 322, these sorts of groups, where he came to an understanding that he realized that there was actually he didn't put it as a conspiracy, a culture that was ingrained in certain people in privileged positions that were perpetuating a system of advantage to certain corporations, which they all had stakes in and so on, and through various organizations that were designed to feed into this culture by placing people in managerial positions, in academic positions, in bureaucratic positions, and so on like that, okay, down through the years. And Skull and Bones is one of the preeminent examples he gave. But what he said that really caught my attention at the time is he said, it sounds like these people have this monolithic power, this ability to just simply steamroll the rest of us, and there's nothing we can do about it. But he put it down to they're in a goldfish bowl. And now we're looking in from the outside, you, me, all the people who are not who are not born into this. We're looking into that goldfish bowl from the outside, and they're turning on each other. They can't get out of that fish bowl because they're so heavily invested in it, but they're turning on each other. And that fish bowl, the glass that we're looking through, is the increase in knowledge that everybody is getting through the craziest theories that you've ever heard to the not so crazy, but everything is in some way, people are starting to have a recognition that what we've been told is conspiracy theory or disinformation or whatever like that, there might be something worth checking out. And the more and more people question, the less likely that these people in that goldfish bowl can maintain their system. And once that financial system implodes on itself, and everybody is educated enough to know we're not going back to that, we don't want anything like that again, because they've always used war and famine as a cover. Oh, look, it was the war, it was the famine. Here's our new system. It's not, it's the old system, but here's our new system. And everybody goes, oh, thank God, just get us out of this mess. The new generation of people, the people born since the Second World War, you know, and have had access and so on to greater forms of knowledge and such, are developing a form of thought where they're not going to be sucked into a reinstitution, a resetting of this old system once again. And that's my great hope. That's the great turning away from that and back towards the true concept of a golden age, which is an age where people can trust that they will be accorded justice, equal justice, under weights and measures and laws that society establishes instead of the crap we see today.
Well, let's hope that comes about. And as you say, something's coming and something has to give now. It's a very interesting time to be here. So we're coming to the end of it, but it's gone so quick again. I wanted to ask you about COVID. What did that play? Shutting all these businesses down, locking people down. Obviously, the virus wasn't the virus that we were told it was. People weren't throwing up blood on buses and passing out everywhere. That was clear as day to anyone for very, very quickly. That everyone had gone mad. There's a lot of different elements to it. Obviously, it ticks a lot of boxes. But in terms of finance, what was the purpose of all of that? Do you believe?
Again, it was to create a catastrophic system of deprivation, poverty, and so on throughout the world, where fearful people are the most easy people to manipulate. Fearful people without any knowledge are even easier to manipulate. So if you can close down society where you minimize contact, all right, because that is their biggest problem. They look at the advent of the printing press by, Goodfield's printing press back in the early Renaissance times as an example of disruptive technology that really messed up what was a good situation for the elites. Right, people became more knowledge. They were able to read stuff that they had to accept and so on. We're now in that situation with the internet, and they are trying to shut down that capacity as much as possible. They are trying to use fear. As far as the details of COVID and so on, I think I told you that when it broke out, I got a sudden resurgence of people being interested in my work, because me and a set of other authors have hinted at the idea that we are heading towards a great culling of the population in an attempt to bring the human population down to manageable levels by an elite, 500 million being what they believe is the most manageable amount. Malthusian economics, that sort of idea that they're all sold on so that they can maintain control over what they consider to be finite resources. So COVID climate change fears, all this sort of stuff, was designed to effectively make us as a species, as the whole of humanity, accept the idea that huge losses of life was just inevitable because of us. We're so stupid. We breed too much. We eat too much. We burn fossil fuels too much. All this sort of thing. And it was their idea that they would create that kind of chaos so they could reset that financial system that we've been talking about, which would be the digital banking currency, the idea of you will own nothing and you will be happy. All these things that we've heard come out of the World Economic Forum. So supposedly free market capitalists. These guys are the most collectivist thinkers that I've ever come across in terms of ruling the vast majority of people under a system that they have total control over. And for me, the biggest surprise that came out of COVID was not that, it wasn't the COVID problem, the disease itself, and so on. It turned out that it was the vaccination. That was the clever aspect of what they were doing. The vaccination, I believe, has introduced long-term problems for the procreation of the species, so that you can commit genocide in the most benign seeming way. Oh, everybody just stopped having babies. They couldn't have babies anymore. You're not killing the people trying to have babies. You're just stopping them being able to produce. So within the space of a generation, you reduce the population dramatically. And I think that this was what was overall in the plan, but they've failed.
Yeah, I mean, that comes back to Bill Gates and Planned Parenthood. Bill Gates again. That's the second time we mentioned him today with 0606. To just back up what you said there, if you look to the First Global Revolution, which is a book released, I believe, by the Club of Rome, which is the Round Table, and this was one of their pieces of writing. So this is a while back now, I believe late 90s. The common enemy of humanity is man. That's the title of this part. I'm sure you've read this before. In search for a new enemy to unite us, we came up with the idea that pollution, the threat of global warming, water shortages, famine, and the like would fit the bill. In their totality and their interactions, these phenomena do constitute a common threat, which demands the solidarity of all peoples. But in designating them as the enemy, we fall into the trap about which we have already warned, namely mistaking symptoms for causes. All of these dangers are caused by human intervention, and it is only through changed attitudes and behaviour that they can be overcome. The real enemy then is humanity itself. That's from the Club of Rome. These are the guys behind the likes of Keir Starmer, Trilateral Commission. This is the mentality we're looking at. So when you come back to the Saturn death cult or the Saturn debt cult, one and the same thing, we're looking at the same mentality here. And they're writing it in their books and they're telling you that it's good for you. I just wanted to ask, we saw the Georgia Guidestones go down a few years ago. What was all that about, do you believe?
Well, I have actually spoken to people who claim to know essentially what that might be about. And their claim was it was Patriot veterans, former American servicemen who have been educated in terms of what those Guidestones actually represent as a philosophy, and have rejected that, who decided to take matters into their own hand. It really was quite incredible, the lack of media interest in terms of why it went down, what caused it. There's never been even a, what would you call it, an official statement as to how they actually, because I mean, it's very clearly they were demolished by some explosive device or something. There's been all kinds of theories about space-based weapons used and so on like that, or just even supernatural elements being involved or whatever. But I'm quite happy to believe that the destruction of the Georgia Guidestones is an example of why I'm optimistic where we're going in the world, that people, they're figuring this stuff out, and there are people like me who write about it and talk about it and so on like that, but there are people out there who are intent on doing something about it. And depending on how they go about it, they could easily become targets themselves. They could break laws, and I would not suggest that anybody take any physical action along those lines, but it seems to be happening otherwise. It's just the way people feel, I think, when they realize how they've been treated by certain elite factions.
Absolutely, and we're at a point now where this Saturn Death cult and this Saturn Death cult is going to move into its next phase, and we just have to be, in my opinion, concerned about who hands over the reins to next, who takes charge of it, because they're lining up the next lot. It's been fantastic to have you, Troy. We're going to have to do parts 3 and parts 4 and meet up for a coffee soon. Where can people find your book and get in touch with you?
Well, it's I sell it as an ebook on Amazon. You can go to saturndeathcult.com to get links on Amazon to the book, where I run a website. I've got 2 books on the subject, roughly on the subject, Saturn Death Cult and the Purple Dawn of Creation, which deals mostly with the cosmology, setting up why there is a cosmological explanation for the existence of the Saturn Death cult culture that we've been talking about. But anybody going to the website will get quite a bit of information on what's in the book. And if you need more, buy the book then.
Well, it's well worth a buy. I've read it as well. I've read the first one right through, and I'll be getting the second one. And thank you for your time. So, guys, remember to do your own research. Come to your own conclusions. We'll see you in a week's time here on Ickonic.com.